Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. In this lecture, we continue our discussion of sectionalism and the growing momentum towards what becomes the Civil War. In the previous lecture, we talked about some underlying sort of distant, deep-seated causes leading toward the Civil War. In this lecture, we're going to begin discussing some of the more immediate causes of the Civil War. In this lecture, talking about the Compromise of 1850, which really brought increasing scrutiny to the issue that ultimately draws us towards war, the expansion of slavery. In the previous lecture, we talked about the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which for a time resolved the issues confronting the expansion of slavery into newly acquired territories. But a number of issues surfacing in the late 1840s brought renewed scrutiny and attention to that issue of the expansion of slavery. One of them, of course, was the Mexican War, which we talked about extensively in the previous chapter, and the many newly acquired territories that brought into the United States. The other we've also discussed in previous lectures, the Gold Rush, which launched in 1848 but gained increasing momentum in 1849. As we discussed, the Gold Rush added greatly to the interest in settling portions of the West, particularly around the various gold strikes, but we talked previously about the growing momentum in places like Oregon and Washington, where people settled as well. But in California itself, the Gold Rush started in 1848. By 1850, there were more than 100,000 people living in California, and the state was ready to apply for statehood, which is going to bring newfound discussion to the matter of whether slavery should be allowed or not in these new territories soon to become states. In March of 1849, the new president, Zachary Taylor, announced that he would allow the new territories to apply for statehood based on popular sovereignty or popular will on the issue of slavery. And clearly, territories like California and New Mexico, which were both ready to appeal for statehood in this period, were inclined to lean against slavery and towards entering the Union as free states. While, of course, many Americans supported that or didn't mind it, those who endorsed and supported slavery were deeply troubled by new states entering as free states, which would upset the balance of power in Congress. In June of 1850, a group of so-called fire eaters, some of the staunchest defenders of slavery, gathered in Nashville, Tennessee, to discuss Southern rights and whether they needed to, quote, devise and adopt some mode of resistance to Northern aggression. Senator Jefferson Davis of Mississippi said, "For the first time, we are about permanently to destroy the balance of power between the sections." So in late 1849, the 31st Congress of the United States convened to pick up this debate. This Congress included some of the greatest figures in our nation's history and dealt with some of its stickiest issues. Included in this Congress were Henry Clay of Kentucky, Daniel Webster of Massachusetts, John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, William Seward of New York, Jefferson Davis of Mississippi, and Stephen Douglas of Illinois. The Congress was nearly evenly divided north and south, with the Senate evenly divided, 30 senators from each side. And so in order to reach any kind of progress, they would have to compromise from both sides. The key issue being debated was the admittance of California to the Union, which, as I've just described, was a critical issue since it would throw off the balance of power in Congress. And as I've also mentioned, the Gold Rush of 1849, the growing population and organization in California meant that they were ready to apply for statehood. There were other issues before the Congress as well. What to do with the rest of the Mexican cession? Other states soon to be applying for statehood, like New Mexico and Utah, what would happen to them? What about slavery in the nation's capital, Washington, D.C.? Should we abolish slavery there? What should be done? And also, what had become a sort of out-of-date Fugitive Slave Act. The original Fugitive Slave Act, passed in 1793, had grown weak and wasn't getting much support from Northerners. Henry Clay of Kentucky, long a believer in a national system and a uniter of the nation, sought to solve all of these problems at once. He submitted an omnibus bill, omnibus meaning everything, with many facets addressing all the different issues in one bill. A series of great speeches and debates followed, but Clay's bill failed. All the congressmen wanted some of the bill to pass, but only a few of them wanted all of it to pass. So the bill failed, and a disheartened Clay left Washington, dying only a few months later. Stephen Douglas of Illinois stepped into the gap and salvaged the dying bill. Recognizing that all the different aspects together could not pass, he broke up the omnibus bill into a series of individual acts which collectively accomplished virtually the same thing as Clay's initial bill. He then engaged in fierce political maneuvering to win supporters for each bill. The result of all of these bills is known as the Compromise of 1850. Both sides got some of what they wanted while surrendering other aspects. First and foremost, California would be admitted as a free state. New Mexico and Utah would organize as territories with popular sovereignty to determine whether they would then enter as free or slave states. So this kind of pushed that decision down the road a bit. As to slavery in Washington, D.C., this compromise decided that the slave trade in Washington would be abolished, but it did not abolish slavery itself. The thought here is that this is the nation's capital. We have foreign dignitaries in our streets all the time. They didn't want to see aspects of the slave trade, but slavery itself continued to persist in Washington, D.C. And the Compromise of 1850 included a much more severe fugitive slave laws. Fugitive slaves were denied a jury trial, and Northerners were compelled to help catch runaway slaves themselves. So if you aided and abetted runaway slaves or refused to assist in tracking them down, you yourself could be prosecuted for that. So, the sectional controversy is averted once again, but only temporarily. The passage of this compromise, while it postponed war and preserved the Union, only brought greater light to the deepening divide between the two sides. Political parties were now kind of breaking apart over this regional divide, and people were voting more and more just based on regional loyalties. And the fugitive slave law was going to provoke an uproar in the North that created more controversy for years to come.